The letter hit the table between them like a gunshot, and Maude Whitaker's hand was shaking so badly she could barely keep herself upright. "You knew," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stillness of that ranch house sitting room, it carried the weight of a death sentence. "You knew my father. You knew exactly who he was and what he did, and you let me ride all the way out here from Cincinnati believing I was a stranger to you." Elijah Shepard stood on the far side of the room, his broad back turned to her, one hand resting against the rough pine wall as though he needed it to hold himself up. The afternoon light slanted through the single west-facing window and caught the dust motes floating between them like tiny suspended accusations. "Maude," he started. "Do not," she said, and something sharpened in her voice, something that had been soft and uncertain all the week she had known him and was now suddenly forged into iron. "Do not say my name like that, like you're sorry. I don't want sorry. I want the truth. My father died without giving me the truth, and someone in this county has it, and the postmaster told me it was you." He turned then, and the expression on Elijah Shepard's face was something she had never seen on any man's face before. It was not guilt exactly. It was not grief exactly. It was the look of a man who had been carrying a secret so long it had become part of his skeleton, and someone had just reached in and taken hold of it. "Sit down," he said quietly. "I will not sit down. Maude." He crossed the room slowly, and she held her ground even though every instinct told her to step backward, to put distance between herself and the thing he was about to say. He stopped 2 feet away from her and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes that she had spent 6 weeks pretending she did not notice. "Your father saved my life, and then I watched him do something I have never been able to explain to another living soul. And yes, I have been carrying the answer to the question he never gave you for 11 years because I did not know if you deserved to hear it or if it would destroy you." The room tilted slightly. Maude pressed her fingertips to the edge of the table to steady herself. "Tell me," she said, and the silence that followed was the longest of her life. It had begun, as most impossible things do, with a telegram and a dead man's papers. Maude Whitaker was 26 years old in the spring of 1882, and she had spent the better part of the last 2 years managing the affairs of her late father's legal practice in Cincinnati, Ohio, sorting through a lifetime's worth of documents, case files, correspondence, and financial records that Thomas Whitaker had left behind in a state of deliberate disorder that she had initially attributed to grief and eventually come to suspect was something far more intentional. Thomas Whitaker had been a respected man, a lawyer of considerable reputation, a deacon of his church, a widower who had raised his daughter with careful attention to her education, and a firm conviction that she did not need to be sheltered from difficult truths. He had told her that often enough that she had believed it. He had said, "Maude, I will never lie to you." He had said it so many times and with such evident sincerity that it had never once occurred to her to question whether he was already lying when he said it. He had died of a heart failure in November of 1880, aged 54, seated at his desk in the middle of the afternoon with a pen in his hand and a glass of water untouched beside him. The doctor said it was fast. The doctor said he would not have suffered. Maude had found comfort in that, or tried to. The strange things had begun emerging slowly. First, there was the bank account she had not known about, modest but real, receiving small regular deposits from a source she could not immediately trace. Then there was the locked drawer in his desk that she had found the key to only by accident, wedged behind the backing of a framed portrait of her mother. Inside the drawer were 3 letters, all from Texas, all addressed in a handwriting she did not recognize, all signed with initials only. The letters were short and careful and told her almost nothing directly, but they implied a great deal. They implied that Thomas Whitaker had made an agreement with someone in Texas in 1871. They implied that this agreement had involved money. They implied that the agreement had gone badly, or at least that it had ended in a way that one of the parties had never fully accepted, and that the party who had not accepted it was not ES. The third letter, dated 1876, said only, "I will keep my word. I always intended to. But you should know the girl deserves better than silence. When the time comes, I hope you find a way to give it to her. The girl." Maude had read that line standing at her father's desk in the cold November light, 6 years after the letter was written and 4 years after her father had received it, and she had felt a cold certainty settle over her that was not grief but something sharper and older. Her father had known something about her, had kept something from her, had been asked to tell her and had chosen not to. She had spent a year and a half trying to trace ES through the post offices in Texas, writing careful letters to county clerks and land offices in the regions the original letters had been postmarked from. She had done it quietly, methodically, the way her father had taught her to build a legal argument, patiently accumulating small facts until they resolved into something undeniable. In January of 1882, she had received a response from the postmaster of a small cattle town in Bexar County called Harlan's Creek, who confirmed that the initials ES corresponded to one Elijah Shepard, a cattleman and landowner of considerable standing in the county, whose ranch lay approximately 6 miles north of the town proper. She had written to Elijah Shepard directly. She had received no response. She had written a second time. She had received no response. She had written a third time, informing him that she intended to come to Texas in the spring, and that she would appreciate his cooperation but did not require it because she would find her answers one way or another. That letter had finally produced a reply. It was 3 sentences long. It said, "Miss Whitaker, I would advise against the journey. Texas in spring is no place for a woman traveling alone. However, if you are determined, I will not be difficult to find." She had read that letter 4 times looking for warmth or welcome or acknowledgement of any kind, and found none of those things. She had booked passage on the train to San Antonio the following week. The journey from Cincinnati to San Antonio in the spring of 1882 took approximately 4 days by rail with the connections required, and Maude spent most of it sitting very straight in her seat with a book open in her lap that she was not reading, watching the landscape change from the green familiarity of Ohio to the wild, red-earthed immensity of Texas. Feeling with each passing mile that she was moving further from everything she had ever known and closer to something she was not sure she was prepared for. She was not a woman given to romanticizing the unknown. She was practical by nature and training, the daughter of a lawyer, the keeper of a household and a practice since she was 19, accustomed to facts and documents and the cold management of difficult situations. She did not allow herself to imagine what Elijah Shepard would be like or what he would tell her. She focused on the question. Her father had kept something from her. She was going to find out what it was. She arrived in San Antonio on a Tuesday afternoon, hired a room at a respectable hotel, slept for 10 hours, and rose the next morning to hire a livery wagon to take her to Harlan's Creek. The driver was a taciturn man named Dolan who told her very little about the county, except that it had been dry and that the grass was thin, and that the Shepard Ranch, which everyone called the Cross S, was the largest operation in the region and had been for 20 years. Harlan's Creek was a town of perhaps 800 souls, dusty and purposeful, with a main street broad enough to turn a cattle wagon in, and lined with the usual establishments of commerce and necessity. There was a hotel, a general store, a feed merchant, a blacksmith, a doctor's office, 2 saloons, a church, and a post office. The post office was where Maude went first. The postmaster was a small, alert man named Greer who had apparently been briefed on her existence by some mechanism she could not immediately identify, because he nodded when she gave her name as though he had been expecting her. "You're here about the Shepard Ranch," he said. "I am here to speak with Mr. Shepard," she said carefully. Greer gave her a look that contained a great deal of local knowledge compressed into a very small expression. "He knows you're coming. He would have known since you were in San Antonio. News travels fast out here, Miss Whitaker." He paused. "He's a good man. I want you to know that before you go out there with whatever it is you're carrying." She thanked him for the information and took a room at the hotel, which was plain and clean and had a window overlooking the main street. She spent the afternoon writing in her journal and organizing the copies she had brought of the 3 letters, and in the evening she ate supper in the hotel dining room and tried not to notice the number of people who were quietly noticing her. She hired a horse the following morning. She had been riding since she was 12 and felt no apprehension about the 6-mile ride out to the Cross S. The land was extraordinary. She admitted that to herself even through the focus of her purpose, vast and dry and alive, with a specific kind of beauty that had nothing to do with gentleness and everything to do with scale and light, and the specific amber color of the grass in the early morning. The sky above Texas was not like any sky she had seen before, a deep, luminous blue that seemed to begin closer to the ground than it had any right to. She found the entrance to the Cross S without difficulty, marked by a simple wooden gate with the brand burned into the crossbar. The road from the gate to the main house was perhaps half a mile of packed caliche dirt lined on either side with scrubby cedar, and as she rode it, she counted 2 line riders in the distance and a string of horses in a far pasture, and the geometric arrangement of corrals and outbuildings that signaled a working operation of considerable size. The house itself surprised her. She had been expecting something grand and deliberate, the architectural assertion of a man who wanted to demonstrate his success. Instead, the main house was a long, low structure of pale limestone with a wide front porch and a tin roof, and the kind of practical simplicity that suggested whoever had built it had been thinking about function first and appearance not at all. It looked like it had grown out of the land rather than been imposed on it. A man was standing on the porch when she rode up. Elijah Shepard was perhaps 32 or 33, tall and spare in the way of men who work hard in dry weather, with dark hair going slightly gray at the temples and a face that was not classically handsome, but had the kind of angular, weathered quality that made you look at it twice, and then find it hard to look away from. He was wearing a plain work shirt and trousers and boots that had been recently cleaned, which told her something she could not quite articulate. He had known she was coming today specifically. He had made some small, careful preparation. He watched her dismount without moving from his position on the porch, and she tied her horse to the hitching rail and walked up the steps and stood in front of him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the dry morning air. "Mr. Shepard," she said. "Miss Whitaker," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and steadier. "You made good time from San Antonio." "I intended to," she said. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, something more careful than amusement. "Come inside," he said. "There's coffee." The interior of the house was as plain and purposeful as the exterior, pine floors and plaster walls and functional furniture that had been chosen for durability rather than style. But there were books on a shelf that she noticed immediately, a good many of them, and not the decorative kind, books that had been read. There was a map pinned to one wall with small marks on it whose meaning she could not immediately interpret. There was a woman's photograph in a simple frame on the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace, faded with age, looking down into the room with an expression of composed dignity. He poured coffee at the kitchen end of the main room and brought both cups to the table and sat across from her with his hands flat on the table and looked at her directly. That directness, she would learn later, was not a performance. It was simply who he was. "You said in your letter that you had questions about your father," he said. "I said I had a question that my father never answered," she corrected. "There is a distinction. What's the question?" She placed the 3 letters on the table, her copies, arranged in order. "These were written by you to my father between 1871 and 1876. The 3rd one mentions a girl who deserves better than silence. I want to know what you meant. I want to know what agreement you had with my father. I want to know what the truth is that he chose not to give me." He looked at the letters for a long time without touching them. She watched his face and saw the same thing she would see again weeks later when she came back to ask him directly, that expression of a man in whom a secret had become structural. "How old are you, Miss Whitaker?" he asked. "That's an unusual response to a direct question. Humor me." "I am 26. He nodded as though confirming something. "Your father told me you were born in 1856. That would have made you 15 when the agreement was made." "What agreement?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father came to Texas in the fall of 1871. He came as a lawyer representing a land company based in Ohio that was attempting to purchase a significant tract of grazing land in this county. The land they wanted to purchase was the land this ranch is sitting on." She held very still. "At the time," he continued, "this ranch belonged to my father, Henry Shepard. He had built it over 20 years. It was the whole of what we had. There were contested claims on it, legal complications from the time before Texas statehood that certain parties were attempting to exploit. Your father was one of the lawyers involved in those attempts. Was my father acting unethically?" She asked because she was her father's daughter and she needed to know the precise shape of the thing she was dealing with. Elijah looked at her for a moment. "He was acting within the law," he said. "Whether it was ethical is a question I spent a long time being angry about and eventually let go of. The law in 1871 gave considerable room for what was done. What matters for your question is what happened next." What had happened next, he told her over the course of the next 2 hours, sitting at that pine table while the coffee went cold and the morning advanced, was this. Thomas Whitaker had arrived in Bexar County in November of 1871 as a representative of the Ohio Land Company. He had reviewed the contested claims and prepared the legal arguments that would have, if pursued to their conclusion, likely resulted in the Shepard family losing their land. He had been in the county for approximately 2 weeks when he had witnessed an event that had changed his calculations entirely. Elijah had been 21 years old at the time. He had been riding fence on the eastern boundary of the ranch when his horse had thrown him at a creek crossing, and the horse had come down on him, and he had been pulled out of the water by a man on the opposite bank who happened to be Thomas Whitaker, returning from an inspection of the contested boundary markers. Thomas Whitaker had pulled Elijah Shepard out of a flooded creek with a broken arm and 2 broken ribs, had gotten him back to the ranch house, and had stayed for 3 days while a doctor was located and brought out from San Antonio. During those 3 days, Henry Shepard had shown him the ranch, had shown him what the land meant, what had been built there, what it would mean to lose it. And Thomas Whitaker had gone back to Ohio and told the land company the claims were not viable and the purchase would not proceed. He threw away a substantial fee, Elijah said, and possibly endangered his professional relationships with the people who had hired him. He did it because he had looked at what we had built and decided it wasn't right to take it. Maude sat with this for a moment. "That is admirable," she said carefully, "but it does not explain the letters. It does not explain the phrase about a girl who deserves better than silence." Elijah looked at the table. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She waited. "My father," he said, "was a grateful man, perhaps too grateful in the way that can cause its own problems. When Thomas Whitaker turned down the assignment and saved the ranch, my father wanted to do something in return. There was correspondence between them over the following years. A friendship in a way, though they never met again after that November." He paused. "My father told your father about my older brother, James. James had died in 1868 at the age of 22, leaving behind a child. The child's mother had died of fever the following year." The room became very quiet. "The child," Maude said. "A girl," Elijah said, "named Clara. She was 3 years old when her mother died. My father raised her alongside me until he died in 1878. He looked up at her then, and his dark eyes were very careful. She is 24 years old now. She is living in San Antonio, married to a schoolteacher, perfectly well and happy. I want to be very clear about that." He paused again. "She is not the girl the letter referred to." Maude stared at him. Then who is? The letter referred to you, he said quietly, and to something your father told my father in one of his letters in 1875, something your father had never told you, something he was apparently still deciding whether to tell you when he died. The silence stretched out until it was almost unbearable, and then Maude said, very steadily, "Say it plainly, Mr. Shepard." "I am not a woman who needs things softened." "Your father told my father," Elijah said, "that you were not his biological daughter, that your mother had been briefly involved with another man before her marriage, that Thomas Whitaker had always known and had chosen to raise you as entirely his own, and had never said a word about it to anyone, not to your mother before she died, not to you, not to any family member. He said in the letter that he was considering telling you because he believed you had a right to know, but that he was afraid of what it would do to your understanding of your mother, and of him, and of yourself." Maude's hand was on the table. She watched it as though it belonged to someone else. It was not shaking, which surprised her. "He never told me," she said. "No," Elijah said, "he didn't. Do you know who the other man was? Your father named him in the letter. He was a man named Arthur Gale, a merchant your mother had known before her marriage. Your father said he had died in 1863, which would mean he had no living claim on any of this. He said Gale never knew about you at all." She sat with it. She sat with the full weight of it, the 11-year-old secret, the careful silence, the man who had called himself her father and raised her with complete and evident love and had still chosen, in the end, to keep this one thing locked away from her in a drawer she had only found by accident. "Why," she said finally, "did my father tell your father any of this?" They were correspondents by letter. They had met briefly in 1871. Why would he confide something so private? Elijah was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said, "that your father needed to tell someone, and my father was someone who was far enough away that it felt safe and who owed him something and who could be trusted." He paused. "And I think he hoped that if he was not brave enough to tell you himself, the fact of having written it down and given it to someone else's keeping would mean it did not simply disappear when he died." Maude looked at him. "You," she said. "He gave it to your father. Your father gave it to you." "My father died in 1878. He left me his papers, and among them was the correspondence with your father. He had written a note saying that if Thomas Whitaker died before telling his daughter what he needed to tell her, I should find a way to make sure she was told. I wrote to your father after my father died. Your father wrote back and said he would handle it himself. He didn't." Elijah met her eyes. "Then he died. And you started writing to me, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I didn't answer, which I now understand was cowardly." She considered him for a long moment. "It was cowardly," she agreed, "but I understand it." Something in his face shifted slightly, a tension releasing that she had not known was there until it was gone. "I am sorry," he said, "for the delay. And for what your father's silence cost you." "It cost me the chance to ask him questions," she said. "That is the main thing it cost me. He loved me, I have no doubt about that. Whatever his reasons for the silence, the love was real." She looked out the window at the wide, dry landscape beyond the glass. "Arthur Gale is dead. My father is dead. My mother has been dead since I was 11. There is no one left to ask questions of." She paused. "Except you. I've told you everything I know." "I believe you," she said, and then more quietly, "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence which surprised her. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "The hotel in town." "How long do you intend to remain in Harlan's Creek?" She considered the question. She had not thought much beyond the getting of the answer. Now that she had the answer, the practical question of what came next presented itself in an unexpected way, because she found, sitting across from this spare, careful, direct man in his plain limestone house in the extraordinary Texas light, that she did not feel the urgent need to leave that she had expected to feel once the question was answered. "I had not decided," she told him. He nodded, as though this was a reasonable answer. "The town has decent enough accommodations. If you find you need anything while you're here, Mrs. Greer at the post office is the most capable woman in the county and will see to whatever you need." She thanked him, and he walked her out to her horse, and she rode back to town in the afternoon light with her father's secret settled in her chest like a stone that had been carried a long distance and finally set down, and the unexpected, unsettling awareness that she was thinking about Elijah Shepard's eyes. She stayed 3 more days. She did not go back to the ranch during those 3 days, but Elijah came to town on the 2nd day on ranch business and found her in the general store examining the quality of the cotton goods on display, and they fell into conversation in the manner of 2 people who have already said difficult things to each other and find that the ordinary things are somehow easier for it. He told her about the county, about the cattle market, about the difficulties of the past dry years and the slow recovery of the grassland. She told him about Cincinnati, about managing the legal practice after her father's death, about the work she had been doing sorting through his papers. Neither of them made any reference to the conversation at the ranch house, as though it was a country they had visited together and chosen to leave behind for the time being. When she left Harlan's Creek on a Friday morning in late April, she was aware of a feeling she could not quite name, not quite reluctance and not quite loss, more the specific quality of an unfinished sentence. She was back in Cincinnati before she admitted to herself that she was thinking about him constantly. It was, she told herself with firm practicality, a natural enough response. He had given her something of great significance. He was connected to her history in a way that no other living person was. The attachment she felt was gratitude and familiarity, and nothing more complicated than that. She believed this for approximately 3 weeks, at which point she found herself at her writing desk at 10 o'clock in the evening, composing a letter that had begun as a thank-you note, and had somehow extended itself to 4 pages covering the discovery of a set of old case files her father had kept that shed interesting light on Ohio property law in the 1860s, and the behavior of a mockingbird that had taken up residence in the oak tree outside her office window, and the particular quality of light over the Ohio River in the early mornings, and she stopped and read what she had written, and understood that she was not writing to a historical connection or an obligation fulfilled. She was writing to a man she wanted to know better. She posted the letter before she could think about it too carefully. His reply arrived in 10 days, which given the distance was as fast as any reply could have arrived. It was 2 pages, and it was written in the same spare, direct prose of his 3-sentence telegram, but it was 2 pages, which she understood as a kind of declaration in itself. He wrote about the cattle market. He wrote about the line of thunderstorms that had come through the county the previous week and broken the drought that had been building since February. He wrote about a book he had been reading, a collection of geological surveys of the Texas Hill Country, and made an observation about the relationship between the limestone formations and the character of the grassland above them that was precise and interesting, and told her something clear about how his mind worked. At the end he wrote, "I find myself curious about your mockingbird. The ones here have an extraordinary variety. I have always thought there is something admirable about a creature that can take the songs of others and make them entirely its own." She read that last line 4 times. She wrote back. He wrote back. The letters came and went through the summer of 1882 with increasing frequency, until by August they were writing twice a week, and the letters had grown longer and more candid and less careful, as though the distance between them had become not a barrier, but a kind of permission to say things they might not have said face to face. She wrote to him about her mother, about the strange grief of learning something new about a person who was gone and could not be asked about it. She wrote about Arthur Gale, who she had looked into through the quiet channels available to a lawyer's daughter, and found to be indeed a merchant who had died in 1863 in Memphis, Tennessee, without known heirs, a man of ordinary life and ordinary death who had touched her history in the most intimate possible way without ever knowing it. She found she felt very little about Arthur Gale. The man who had been her father in every real sense was Thomas Whitaker, and she had known it and would go on knowing it. He wrote back about his own father, about Henry Shepard, who had built the Cross S with his hands and his stubbornness, and his absolute refusal to let the land go when everyone told him he should. About his older brother James, who had died at 22 of a fever in a county 100 miles to the west, leaving behind an infant daughter and a set of debts that had taken the ranch 3 years to work out from under. About Clara, the niece, now settled happily in San Antonio with her schoolteacher husband and a young son. He wrote about the ranch with the kind of precision that told her it was not just a business to him, but something he had poured himself into as completely as any person can pour themselves into a piece of land, and she understood that the ranch was not just where he lived but what he was. In September, he wrote a letter that was different from the others. It began ordinarily enough: a report on the cattle prices at the San Antonio market, a note about the first cool night of the season. Then it said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me directly, because I have found that is the only kind of conversation that is worth having. Do you intend to return to Texas?" She sat with that letter for 24 hours before answering, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to be entirely sure before she said what she intended to say. She wrote back, "Yes, in October if the weather holds. I have unfinished business in Harlan's Creek." She did not specify what the unfinished business was. She suspected he knew. She arrived in October of 1882, 6 months after her first visit, and this time she did not hire a livery wagon but came in on the stage from San Antonio and found Elijah Shepard waiting on the stage platform with his hat in his hands, which was a thing she had not expected, and which produced in her chest a warmth she made no further effort to explain away. He drove her to the hotel in the Cross S's buggy, and they talked easily and without self-consciousness in the way of people who have been writing to each other for months and find the transition from paper to presence less difficult than they had feared. He looked the same, she thought, and different. The same lean height and careful dark eyes and weathered face, but the expression was less guarded than it had been in April. He looked at her directly and did not seem to be working to manage what he let her see. She stayed at the hotel. The arrangement was proper and correct, and she had no expectation of anything else. But he came to town every day that week, which was not his usual habit, and she rode out to the ranch twice with him in the buggy, and on the second of those visits, he showed her the whole of the operation: the breeding stock in the south pasture, the remuda, the bunkhouse where 12 hands lived during the working season, the stone barn he had built the previous year, the kitchen garden behind the house, tended by a woman named Dolers who had cooked and managed the household for the Shepard family since before Elijah was born, and who received Maude with a thoughtful dignity that told her she was being assessed and that the assessment was ongoing. On the evening of that second visit, when the light was going gold over the cedar ridges and the air had the clean, dry smell of Texas autumn, they sat on the front porch and he brought out 2 cups of coffee and they sat in the chairs that faced west and watched the sun go down, and Elijah said, quietly and without preamble, "I want to be honest with you about something." "Please," she said. "I have been in the habit," he said slowly, "of keeping a certain amount of distance from people. It has seemed practical. The ranch takes everything I have in terms of time and energy and decision-making, and I have told myself for a long time that it would not be fair to ask someone to fit themselves around a life like this." He looked at the sunset rather than at her. "I have also told myself that I am not a man who is easy to know, which is true, but I am less certain than I used to be that it is a reason for anything. Is this a roundabout way of telling me something specific?" She asked, because she was her father's daughter, and she was not made for roundabout approaches. He looked at her then, and she held his gaze, and the particular quality of the moment was something she understood she would remember for a very long time. "I would like to know you better," he said. "In whatever way you are willing to allow. I want to be clear that I am not speaking casually." She looked at the sunset. She thought about Cincinnati, about the office, about the mockingbird in the oak tree, about the 4 pages of a letter that had been a thank-you note. She thought about the question she had come to Texas to settle, and the answer that had been waiting for her, and the unexpected thing that had attached itself to the answer, invisible and persistent. "I am not a woman who requires things to move slowly," she said, "but I also do not believe in rushing things that deserve care." She paused. "I am willing to allow a great deal, Mr. Shepard. I think you should know that." His expression changed, and she saw in it something she had not quite seen on his face before, something that was not guardedness and not formality and was simply quietly warmth. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back." "I was always going to come back," she said honestly. "Once I had started writing to you, I knew it was only a matter of time." The October evening settled around them, cool and fragrant with cedar smoke from somewhere on the property, and they sat in companionable silence that was not empty, but full of things being understood without being said. And Maude thought that she had never sat in a silence quite like this with anyone before, not with her father, not with the 2 or 3 men who had previously attempted to interest her in marriage, not with any friend or colleague in Cincinnati. There was something about the particular quality of being understood without performance that was, she decided, the rarest and best thing one person could offer another. She extended her stay from 1 week to 3. During those 3 weeks, she became familiar with the rhythms of the Cross S in a way that was not accidental. She rode with him in the early mornings before the heat came up, learning the fence lines and the water sources and the names of the cattle hands, who ranged from a taciturn man of 50 called Morgan, who had been on the ranch since Henry Shepard's time, to a young man of 19 named Tomás, who was the son of one of the county's oldest Mexican-Texan families, and who was the fastest roper she had ever seen. She sat in on conversations about cattle prices and water rights and the logistics of the fall drive to the railhead at San Antonio, and she asked questions that were not naive, and Elijah answered them with the same directness that had characterized everything between them from the beginning. She also came to understand the county better, the complex social fabric of a place that had been, within living memory, the frontier. There were the old Anglo-Texan families who had been there since before statehood, and the Mexican-Texan families who had been there longer and whose relationship with the newer arrivals was a thing of careful negotiation and historical injury that she observed with the attention of a woman trained to read the dynamics of power. There were the freedmen who had come west after the war and established themselves with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of acceptance, and she noted, with both appreciation and the necessary caveat of not imagining things were simple, that the Cross S employed men of both groups, and that Elijah treated them with a consistency of respect that she filed away as meaningful information about his character. She also met a woman named Ada Greer, the postmaster's wife, who was 43 years old and had lived in Harlan's Creek since she was 20, and who had the quality of knowing everything about everyone that is both invaluable and slightly alarming in a small community. Ada Greer took Maude to tea at the parsonage on her second Wednesday in town, ostensibly because the minister's wife wanted to meet the visitor from Ohio, and in fact because Ada Greer wanted to look at Maude carefully in good light and determine something to her own satisfaction. "He has not courted anyone," Ada told her, pouring tea with the authority of a woman who understands that information is a form of generosity. "Not in the 10 years I have known him. He was not a monk about it, I will not pretend otherwise, but he has never courted anyone seriously, and the women of this county who tried to interest him gave it up as a lost cause by about 1879. She regarded Maude over the rim of her cup. "He has answered every letter you sent within 10 days. I know because I processed the mail." "That is not perhaps information you are supposed to share," Maude said. "Perhaps not," Ada agreed cheerfully. "But I thought you should know because some women need to hear the evidence laid out plainly before they trust what they already know." Maude thought about that for a moment. "You are very like someone my father would have liked," she said. Ada looked pleased. "Your father sounds like a complicated man." "He was," Maude said. He was also a good one. I have decided to hold both of those things at the same time. That, said Ada, is how you get through this life. The letter that Maude wrote to her father's former law partner in Cincinnati, informing him that she was considering remaining in Texas for an extended period and possibly permanently, was one of the most difficult letters she wrote in a life that would contain many difficult letters. Not because she was uncertain about the decision, but because putting it on paper made real a shift that she had been making internally for weeks. The shift from the question of what her father had not told her to the question of what she herself wanted her life to contain. She knew the answer. She had known it, she suspected, since she had sat on the porch of the Cross S and watched the Texas sunset and felt the silence between her and Elijah Shepard as something generous and alive. What she had not done was say it to him plainly, because even she, who was not a woman for roundabout approaches, found that some things required a particular moment. The moment came on an evening in late October, 3 days before she was scheduled to return to Cincinnati. They had ridden out together to the north pasture to check on a section of fence that Morgan had reported needed attention. And the fence did need attention, and they attended to it together, she holding the wire taut while Elijah drove the new staples with a speed and efficiency that spoke of long practice. And afterward they sat on the horses for a while and looked at the land. The light was long and amber, the shadow of the cedar ridge cutting across the grass at a sharp angle, and the sky above was doing something extraordinary with a few high clouds that were catching the last of the sun and turning colors that she did not have precise names for. "I don't want to go back to Cincinnati," she said. It was not rehearsed. It came out with the simple directness of something that had been true for a while and needed to be said. He looked at her. He was very still on his horse. "I want to be clear about what I mean," she continued, because she was not a woman who said things by implication when she could say them plainly. "I do not mean that I dislike Cincinnati or that there is nothing there for me. I mean that I have found in the past 3 weeks that I am more myself here than I have been in a very long time, and that a significant part of that has to do with you, and that I would like to discuss what that might mean practically if you are willing." He was quiet for a long moment. A pair of mockingbirds were exchanging elaborate songs somewhere in the cedar, and the horses stood patiently. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about how to ask you to stay. I have been trying to determine the right way to put it that is honest without being presumptuous." "Just say it," she said. "You told me in April that you preferred plain conversation. So do I." He looked at her with the full, careful attention that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not just this season. Permanently. I'm asking you to marry me, Maude. I'm asking you because I have not wanted anything this much since I wanted my father's land to stay in the family, and that is the most honest comparison I have." She smiled. She could not help it. "That is, without question, the least romantic proposal I have ever heard." Something moved in his expression, the closest thing to alarm she had seen on his face, and she found it entirely endearing. "I can try again." "Don't," she said. "I loved it. It was perfectly you." She looked at him across the amber light and the dry grass and the extraordinary Texas sky. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Elijah." The look on his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. They were married in January of 1883 in the church in Harlan's Creek, in a ceremony conducted by the minister whose wife had served the tea where Ada Greer had laid out the evidence. Ada Greer cried at a volume that was not proportional to her size, but was entirely proportional to her investment in the outcome. Morgan and Tamaz and the other Cross S hands attended in their Sunday clothes, which in Morgan's case appeared to be the same as his Monday clothes but had been brushed. Dolers prepared a meal after the ceremony that was itself a form of blessing, and Clara came up from San Antonio with her schoolteacher husband and their son, a vigorous 2-year-old named Henry after his great-grandfather, and the sight of that child careening around the ranch house with the absolute confidence of someone who belonged there made Maude feel, for the first time, something she could not quite name. a sense that the story she was inside was larger than the question she had arrived with and better than anything she had thought to hope for. She had written to her father's law partner formally closing her involvement in the Cincinnati practice and had arranged for the apartment she had kept there to be given up and had sent the last of her belongings by freight wagon. The Cross S was her home now. The limestone house with its wide porch and its tin roof and its view west toward the cedar ridges was the place she would wake up in every morning, and she found that instead of the loss she had half expected there was a continuous sense of rightness, the specific satisfaction of a person who has found the place they belong to. She and Elijah settled into the rhythms of a shared life with the same directness that had characterized their correspondence and their courtship, without pretense and without performance, working out the practical arrangements of two capable and independent people becoming a single household. She was not a woman who intended to be decorative, and he was not a man who would have known what to do with a decorative wife. She took over the management of the ranch's accounts and correspondence, which had been handled in a piecemeal way by Elijah and by a bookkeeper who came in from town twice a month, and brought to it the same methodical precision she had applied to her father's law practice. And within 3 months, the accounts were in better order than they had been in years, and she had identified 2 suppliers who had been overbilling by enough to matter. Elijah watched this with an expression that she had come to recognize as his version of delight, the slight elevation of one corner of his mouth, and the quality of attention he gave to things he was genuinely interested in. He told her once on a quiet evening in February with the fire going and the wind from the north rattling the tin roof that he had not imagined it would be like this. "Like what?" she asked. "Like having someone to think with," he said. "I have had people to work with and people to talk at and people who talked at me, but thinking with someone is different." He looked at her over the top of the geological survey he had been reading. "I should have done it years ago." "You would have had to find the right person," she pointed out. "Yes," he said simply, "I would have." She had been at the Cross S for 6 months when the dispute with the neighboring rancher came to a head. The neighbor's name was Caldwell, and he was a man of about 50 who had expanded his operation aggressively over the previous decade by a combination of competitive land purchase, and it was whispered in town, some approaches to boundary marking that were not strictly in accordance with the surveyed lines. He had a parcel that abutted the eastern boundary of the Cross S, and he had been pushing cattle onto the Cross S's eastern grass since the previous fall, and Morgan had reported it 3 times, and Elijah had spoken to Caldwell twice, and Caldwell had been unpleasant both times but had not changed his behavior. Maude had been listening to all of this and had been, against her better judgment, keeping her own counsel. But when Elijah came in one evening with the news that Caldwell had spoken to the county commissioner about a boundary adjustment that would, if approved, grant him 1,200 acres of Cross S grass by means of a disputed old survey, she set down her pen. "Let me see the original survey documents," she said. He looked at her. "You think you can find something?" "I think I am the daughter of a property lawyer, and I have been reading land documents since I was 17, she said. "Show me what you have." What she had, after 3 days of careful analysis of the original survey, plats from the land office records, combined with the correspondence her father-in-law had maintained with the original surveyor in 1862, was a chain of documented evidence that not only contradicted Caldwell's claim, but demonstrated that the survey he was relying on had been conducted with a compass that had produced a consistent eastward error. Which meant that if anything, the current Cross S boundary markers were positioned slightly in Caldwell's favor, not the reverse. She wrote up the analysis in the form of a legal brief, which she was not technically licensed to produce, but which was entirely sound in its reasoning, and Elijah took it to the county commissioner's office in San Antonio with a lawyer from Harlan's Creek named Prescott, and the boundary adjustment claim was declined within 2 weeks. Caldwell pushed his cattle back to his own grass and did not speak to Elijah at all for the next year, which suited everyone adequately. Prescott told Elijah afterward that it was the finest piece of land law work he had seen produced outside of a professional firm. Elijah came home and told Maude this, and she looked at him with a slight smile and said that she had only done what the evidence supported, and he said that she was being modest, and she said that she was not a modest woman by nature, but she was a precise one, and the distinction was important. He laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, and she realized, hearing it, that she had been waiting to hear it without knowing she was waiting, and that it was the best sound she had heard since the mockingbirds in the north pasture that evening in October. By the spring of 1883, she was expecting their first child, which she announced to Elijah on a Sunday morning over breakfast in the manner of someone presenting a fact for consideration, which she acknowledged even as she was doing it was perhaps not the most romantic approach to the news, but it was who she was, and he looked at her across the table with an expression that contained a great deal, none of which she needed to have named. He got up from his chair and came around the table and held her face in both his hands the way she had noticed he held things that mattered to him, carefully and with full attention, and he said, "Are you well? Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfectly all right," she said. "Good," he said, and held her for a long time in the morning light, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who has found the exact right place to stand. The pregnancy was unremarkable in the medical sense, which was the best that could be said of any pregnancy in the American West in 1883. Dolers, who had seen enough of life to be sanguine about nearly everything, was a calm and practical presence. Ada Greer appointed herself a kind of unofficial advisor and brought books and opinions in equal measure. The doctor from San Antonio who came out to the ranch in the middle of September was a careful, competent man named Dr. Vasquez, who had been delivering babies in Bexar County for 20 years and had the unhurried confidence of long experience. Their son was born in September of 1883, on a Tuesday afternoon when the first cool front of autumn was bringing clouds in from the northwest, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since morning. He was a healthy, vigorous boy who made his opinions about the world known immediately and at volume, and Elijah held him with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered and looked down at him for a long time without speaking. "Thomas," Maude said, "if you agree." He looked up at her. His expression was something she had never seen on his face before, something that was simply open in a way that made everything underneath it visible. "Thomas Henry Shepard," he said. "Yes," she said. "Exactly." The boy flourished in the way that children flourish when they are surrounded by people who are competent and loving and relatively untroubled by small disasters. He was walking by 11 months and talking by 14, and his first complete sentence, witnessed by Dolers and reported to Elijah and Maude with a satisfaction that suggested she found it personally significant, was an instruction to a barn cat to stop sitting on the bucket he wanted to use. He was, by every measure, a child entirely at home in the landscape he had been born into, as comfortable on horseback by the age of 3 as on his own feet. The Cross S prospered through the mid-1880s, not without difficulty, because no cattleman's life was without difficulty in a decade that brought drought and market fluctuation, and the slow mechanization that was changing the industry in ways that required constant adaptation. Elijah navigated these things with the same methodical determination his father had brought to building the ranch, and Maude navigated them with him, her management of the books and contracts and correspondence not a subordinate contribution, but a full and equal one that she made no false modesty about, and that he valued with the consistency of a man who was not troubled by competence in any form it came in. There was a season in 1885 that was genuinely difficult, when a prolonged drought and a collapse in the cattle prices at the San Antonio market came together, in a way that required the kind of financial restructuring that Maude handled with an efficiency that saved the ranch from the fate that took 3 smaller operations in the county that year. Elijah came home from a meeting in town one afternoon with the news that one of those operations, a family called the Duncans, had sold out and moved east, and he was quiet for the rest of the evening with the specific quietness of someone who is thinking about contingency and gratitude simultaneously. That night he said to her in the darkness of their room with the night sounds of the Texas ranch around them, "I want you to know that I am aware of what you did this year, what it cost you in terms of work and worry." "It cost me nothing I was not willing to spend," she said. "I know that," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say. You could have been doing any number of other things with your intelligence and your skills, Maude. You chose to put them here." "I chose to put them where I wanted to be," she said. "Those are the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying to think of the right way to say this for a long time," he said. "I'm not a man who speaks easily about interior things. You know that. But I want to say it plainly because you have told me you prefer plain things." He paused. "You are the best thing in my life. The best choice I have ever made was not to dissuade you from coming to ask your questions, because if you had not come, I would not have found you, and I cannot imagine what that would have meant." She lay in the darkness and held what he had said and felt it settle into her with the quality of something true. "I cannot imagine it either," she said, "and I've tried. It seems like a much smaller life than this one." He found her hand in the dark and held it, and the night outside was full of crickets and the distant sound of one of the horses moving in the pasture, and the limestone walls of the house held the warmth of the day, and Maude Whitaker Shepard thought that she had come to Texas to settle a question, and had found instead the whole architecture of a life that she had not known she was building toward. The second child came in 1887, a girl they named Eleanor, after nobody in particular and after the quality of the name itself, which Maude said had weight to it, and Elijah agreed. Eleanor was different from Thomas from her first hour, quieter and more observant, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's absolute certainty about what she wanted, and was not yet willing to indicate the precise nature of those wants. By the time she was 2, she had a specific expression when confronted with an obstacle that both Maude and Elijah recognized and found, privately, enormously encouraging. Thomas was 4 when Eleanor was born, and took his role as older brother with an earnestness that made Dolores visibly emotional, and Morgan, who was not a demonstrative man, nonetheless find reasons to be in the immediate vicinity of the children with unusual frequency. The county changed around them through the 1880s, as all of Texas was changing, the long cattle drives to Kansas becoming less necessary as the railroads pushed further into the territory, and the San Antonio stockyards expanded. There were fences now where there had been open range, and the old ways of working cattle were giving way to newer efficiencies, and men who had been on the range for 30 years shook their heads about it, while the younger hands adapted without nostalgia. Elijah adapted too, with the pragmatism that had always characterized his approach to the land, shifting the operation to focus more on breeding quality stock for the feedlot market, and less on the long trail drives that had been the ranch's primary function in his father's time. Maude became, in these years, a person of some standing in the community in her own right, which had not been her intention, but which was the natural result of being who she was in a place where capable people were needed. She helped establish a lending library in the back room of the general store, funded by a small subscription system she organized. She assisted 3 women in drafting letters to the state land office over a water rights dispute that affected 3 farms to the south of the county. She taught Sunday school for 2 years until the arrival of a new minister's wife, who was better suited for it than she was, and who she handed off the role to with cheerful relief. She wrote regularly to Clara in San Antonio, a correspondence that had begun as an extension of her connection to the Shepard family history and had become a genuine friendship. Clara came to visit in the summer of 1888 with her husband, whose name was Robert, and their 2 boys. And the visit was one of those rare weeks when the house felt exactly the size it needed to be, full and warm and alive with the combination of adult conversation and children's chaos. That is one of the best possible states for a household to be in. Clara, who had grown up knowing the story of how Thomas Whitaker had saved the Cross S, sat with Maude on the porch one evening after the children were in bed and said, with the directness that Maude had come to understand ran in some form through everyone connected to this family, "Do you ever think about your father? About the question, I mean, the one you came here to settle." Maude considered the evening around them, the warm September air and the particular amber quality of the light dying over the cedar ridges and the sound of Elijah's voice from inside the house reading to the children before bed, a nightly ritual that had become one of the things she loved most about the shape of their days. "I think about him often," she said. "Not about the question anymore. About him. About who he was. A man capable of tremendous integrity, who also chose a particular silence. I have come to understand that those 2 things are not contradictions. They are just the truth about how complicated a person can be." "Do you think he would have told you eventually?" Clara asked. "I think he was building up to it," Maude said. "I think he intended to. I think he ran out of time." She was quiet for a moment. "I have decided to be at peace with that. Not because it was the right choice on his part, but because I cannot unknow what I know, and what I know has given me this. Has given me Elijah and this ranch and this life. So if I am honest, the question that was never answered led me to the answer I needed most, which was not about Arthur Gale or about bloodlines or about what my father kept from me. It was about where I was supposed to be." Clara looked at her with her great uncle's dark eyes and her father's determined expression. "He would have loved you," she said. "My great-grandfather Henry, he would have known immediately that you were exactly right for Elijah and for this place." "I like to think so," Maude said, "though I suspect he would have made me prove it first." Clara laughed. "Oh, definitely." The 3rd child came in 1889, another boy, whom they named James, after Elijah's brother, after the young man who had died too soon and left behind Clara and a debt, and a piece of this family's history. James Shepard was born in March with considerable opinions about the matter and red-faced urgency about making them known, and grew into a child who moved through the world with a physical confidence that Thomas, who was still on the ranch and now running the remuda, said was the best natural horsemanship he had seen in a child of 5, which Thomas did not say about many things. Elijah taught all 3 of his children to ride and to rope, and to read a cattle brand and to locate water in dry country, and to navigate by the stars, and to treat the men who worked the ranch with the same fundamental respect they would want to be treated with themselves. Maude taught them to read well and to think carefully and to write clearly and to add up a column of figures without error and to ask good questions and to sit with the answers when the answers were not simple. She also taught them, when they were old enough, the story of how she had come to Texas. Not all of it, not the parts about Arthur Gale that were more complication than illumination, but the heart of it, that she had come with a question her father had never answered. That she had found the answer in a limestone ranch house in Bexar County. That the answer had turned out to be larger and better and more complicated than the question, the way answers usually are when you have the patience and the courage to go looking for them. Thomas, who was the most literal of the 3 children, asked her once when he was about 9, "But what was the question?" She thought about it carefully. "The question was who I was," she said, "where I came from, what my father had kept from me. But the real question, the one underneath that one, was whether I was brave enough to go find out." He considered this with his father's careful attention. "Were you scared, terrified," she said, "every mile from Cincinnati? But you went anyway." "I went anyway," she said. He seemed to find this satisfactory, in the way of 9-year-old boys who are collecting information about the character of their parents and determining whether they can be trusted as guides to life. He went back to the book he had been reading, and she watched him for a moment in the afternoon light of the ranch house kitchen, this boy with her eyes and his father's strong hands, sitting in the house that had been built by his grandfather and saved by a decision made in an Ohio law office in 1871, and she felt the full, dense weight of the history that had converged to produce this exact moment, this child, this house, this life. The years that followed settled into the particular richness of a life well built. The Cross S continued to prosper, not in dramatic surges but in the steady, compounding way of an operation managed with intelligence and care. Elijah expanded the breeding program and brought in a new strain of Hereford cattle that improved the quality of the herd over the course of a decade. Maude expanded the accounts system and eventually, when the county organized a proper bank in 1891, helped to formalize the arrangements that a number of the surrounding ranches had been conducting informally through personal credit. She and Elijah did not agree about everything. That would have been both impossible and undesirable. They disagreed, sometimes fiercely, about the management of certain ranch hands, about the pace of certain improvements, about the degree to which the children should be given latitude in making their own decisions before they were adults. These disagreements were conducted with the directness that had been the foundation of their relationship from the first letter, neither of them given to sulking or to strategic silence, both of them committed to the principle that you said what you meant, and listened to what was said in return and arrived, usually, at something better than either of you had started with. They also agreed about the essential things, which were more numerous and more important than the points of disagreement. They agreed about the land and what it required and what it was worth. They agreed about the people who worked it and what they were owed. They agreed about their children and who those children were becoming. They agreed, in the wordless way of people who have built a life together so completely that the seams no longer show, about what they were to each other. In the summer of 1892, Ada Greer died peacefully in her sleep at 63, and the whole of Harlan's Creek mourned her in the particular way that small communities mourn the people who have been their connective tissue, the people who knew everything and loved most of it, and whose knowledge of others' lives was itself a form of tenderness. Maude gave a eulogy at the funeral that she had spent a week writing, and that said what needed to be said about a woman who had been among the first to understand what the Cross S was gaining, and had told Maude so directly and without sentiment. Afterward, Elijah held her hand walking back from the churchyard, and she was grateful for his quietness and for the warmth of his hand and for the fact that he did not try to fix or mitigate or reframe what she was feeling. "She was the first person in this county who made me feel welcome," Maude said, "in a particular way. Not politely welcome, genuinely welcome, like she had decided I was good for the place and she wanted me to know it." "She was right," Elijah said. "About which part?" "About all of it," he said. "You are good for the place." She looked at him. He was 42 now, the gray at his temples more extensive than it had been when she had first ridden up to his porch 10 years ago, the lines of his face more settled, the particular quality of his presence unchanged. She thought, not for the first time, that he had become more himself over the years in the way that good people do, not different but more completely what he had always been. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am aware in the clearest possible way of what this life is. What it has been, what you have been in it." He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the first, with that full, careful attention. "Tell me," he said. "You are," she said, "the answer I found when I came to settle a question, and I think about that often. I came here to find out what my father had not told me, and what I found was that the silence he kept, as wrong as it was, had put me on the road that led to you, to this, to everything this has been." She paused. "I do not think I have ever said that to you so directly." "You have said it in other ways," he said, "but I am glad to hear it directly. You know that I prefer it." "I do know that," she said. "It is one of my favorite things about you." They stood for a moment at the edge of the churchyard in the summer heat, with the sound of the town around them and the blue Texas sky above, and then they walked home together, which was what they did, which was what they had always done, which was what they would go on doing. The children grew and the ranch grew, and the years accumulated with the comfortable weight of a life that had been built with intention and tended with care. Thomas, at 17, had the look of his father and the sharpest mind Maude had encountered since her own father, and she had private conversations with him about the possibility of university that she had not yet had with Elijah, not because she was being strategic, but because she was still working out the right way to say that she thought their son was capable of more than one kind of future and deserved to know all his options. She raised it with Elijah on a February evening in 1900, when the century had just turned over, and there was a quality to the air of new possibility that she would not have admitted to believing in but could not entirely ignore. "Thomas wants to be here," Elijah said immediately. "He's always wanted to be here." "I know that," she said, "but wanting to be here and having chosen to be here are different things. I want him to choose it, not settle for it." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "You think I settled for it," he said, not an accusation, a question. "No," she said. "I think this land chose you as much as you chose it, and that is a different thing. But Thomas should know what else the world contains before he comes back to this." She paused. "I came to Texas from a long way away, Elijah. I had seen something of the world. I knew what I was choosing. I want that for him." He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "Talk to him." She did. Thomas listened to his mother with his father's careful attention and then said, with the directness that ran through all of them, "Would you have wanted me to stay in Cincinnati if you had been happy there?" She looked at him. He was almost her height now, broad in the shoulders like Elijah, with the quality of contained intelligence that she associated with her father and had clearly passed along in some form. "No," she said. "I would have wanted you to go to wherever you were supposed to be." "I know where I'm supposed to be," he said, "but I'll take a year at university if it will let you believe that I chose it." She felt a wave of something that was not quite pride and was not quite grief, but had elements of both. The feeling of a parent who has done the job well enough that the child no longer strictly needs them for the largest decisions. "1 year," she said, "and then we'll see." He went to Austin in 1901 and came back in 1902 with a comprehensive education in land law and agricultural science. A wife named Cecilia, who was the daughter of an Austin professor and who had never been on a working ranch in her life, and took to it with a game, interested willingness that Maude recognized as a quality to build on, and the absolute confirmed certainty that the Cross S was where he intended to spend his life. Eleanor went the opposite direction entirely, which Maude had suspected she might. She went to a women's college in the East, and she stayed, and she became a teacher of mathematics in Philadelphia, and she came home to the Cross S for Christmas every year with presents and opinions, and the quality of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was somewhere different from where her parents were, and the Cross S received her every year with the warmth of a place that understands that belonging to it does not always mean living in it. James, the youngest, was the one who would surprise them both the most, though not in a way that caused anyone distress. He married at 22, a young woman from one of the old Mexican-Texan families in the county named Rosario, whose family had been working cattle in Bexar County since before the Shepards had arrived, and the wedding was held at the Cross S on a warm October day that had the same extraordinary amber light of every important October in this story. And Elijah danced at his youngest son's wedding with a particular lightness that Maude had not seen in him before and recognized as joy of a very specific and uncomplicated kind. She danced with him too later, when the musicians had shifted to slower songs and the evening was coming in and the lanterns around the yard were lit, and she was 52 years old and had been married to this man for 20 years, and she still felt, in the circle of his arms on the packed earth of the ranch yard, the specific quality of a person who has arrived exactly where they needed to be. "I have been thinking," she said, as they moved slowly in the lantern light, "about a letter." "Which letter?" "The third one," she said, "the one that said the girl deserved better than silence. I have been thinking about whether I agree." He looked at her. "And I think the silence led me somewhere I could not have arrived at any other way," she said. "I think if my father had told me directly, I would have processed it and filed it and moved on. I would not have gone to Texas. I would not have written to ES. I would not have found you." "That's a generous way to think about it." "It's an accurate way," she said. "I am not generous by nature. You know that." He smiled. In 20 years she had learned every version of his smile, and this was the one she loved best, quiet and genuine, and for her specifically. "I know that," he said. "He still should have told me," she said. "I want to be clear about that. The silence was wrong, and it was cowardly, and he would have known it. But it pointed me in the right direction, and I am grateful for that, and I have made my peace with the rest of it." He held her a little closer in the lantern light, and the music went on, and the voices of their family and their neighbors filled the October air around them. And Maude Whitaker Shepard, who had come to Texas in 1882 to settle a question her father had never answered, and had found a cattleman who had held the answer for 11 years, closed her eyes and rested her head against her husband's shoulder and felt, with the full and specific clarity of a woman who has learned to name her own good fortune, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The cross S went on. Thomas managed it with growing confidence, and Cecilia managed Thomas with affectionate practicality, and their 2 boys, Henry and William, were the next generation installed on the land that Henry Shepard had built, and Thomas Whitaker had saved with a decision made in a cold Ohio winter, and Elijah Shepard had kept, and Maude Whitaker had chosen. James and Rosario built a house on the eastern portion of the property, and ran the breeding operation with a skill and attention that made even Morgan, who was long retired and living in a cottage in town, nod with something approaching approval when he visited. Elijah turned 60 in 1910, and Maude organized a dinner that was attended by most of Harlan's Creek and all of the family, and Clara came up from San Antonio for it, white-haired and sharp-eyed, and still capable of laying out evidence plainly when the occasion required. She sat next to Maude at dinner and looked out at the assembled company, the 3 generations of Shepards and the people who were attached to them by love or loyalty or long service, and said quietly, "My great-grandfather would have been very pleased." "Henry," Maude said. "Henry," Clara confirmed. "He worried about Elijah, you know." "I was too young to understand it at the time, but I heard it later from people who knew him. He worried that Elijah was too serious, too contained, too willing to pour everything into the land and not save enough for himself." Maude looked at her husband across the table, his dark eyes going to her as they always did in any room they shared, the pull between them as consistent and unremarkable as gravity after 27 years. "He figured it out," she said. "He did," Clara agreed. "With considerable help." "As did I," Maude said. "It worked both ways." "That," said Clara, pouring more wine with the authority of a woman who had been watching this particular love story unfold for 30 years, "is precisely the point. They had 11 more years together, she and Elijah. Good years, the kind of years that are built not from dramatic events but from the patient accumulation of ordinary days that are, when you add them up, the structure of an entire life. Mornings on the porch watching the light come across the cedar ridges. Evenings by the fire with books and the comfortable silence of 2 people who had long since run out of secrets, and found the absence of secrets to be not an emptiness, but a kind of spaciousness. Summers with grandchildren underfoot, winters that were sometimes hard and always managed. He died in the spring of 1921, at 71, peacefully and at home, in the limestone house he had been born in, with Maude beside him and Thomas and James, and a letter from a leaner that had arrived by some grace of postal efficiency the morning of the day he died, as though she had known. He had been declining since January in the gradual way of a man whose body had finally honored its long service by beginning to lay its burden down, and he had been characteristically practical about the whole of it, settling his affairs and speaking plainly to each of the people he loved about what he wanted them to know, which was the way he had done everything. To Maude he said, on one of the last evenings when he was awake and clear, and the April air was coming through the open window with the smell of new grass, "You know what you are to me. I have said it in various ways over 40 years, but I want to say it one more time plainly, because you have always deserved plain things." He held her hand. "You are the answer to every question I didn't know I was asking. You are the best thing that ever walked through my door, and I am grateful every day of every year since that April in 1882 that you did not let my silence dissuade you. I told you in my third letter," she said, holding his hand in both of hers, "that I did not require your cooperation. I merely hoped for it." He smiled. That quiet, genuine smile for her specifically. "You have always been terrifyingly determined," he said. "Yes," she said, "and it has served me very well." He died 2 days later, and Maude was 75 years old and had buried her father and her mother and Ada Greer, and a number of other people she had loved. And she knew from experience that grief does not follow a schedule and cannot be managed into a smaller shape. But she also knew herself well enough to know that she was not a woman who was broken by the things that broke her. She was a woman who grieved fully and then picked up the necessary work and went on, because going on was itself a form of honoring what had been. She lived for another 6 years in the limestone house, managing her own affairs with precision and competence until the last year, when Thomas and Cecilia moved her into a room in the main house that had been prepared with the specific combination of practicality and love that characterized everything the Cross S did. She spent her final summer on the porch in the same chair she had sat in on that first October evening when Elijah had asked her to stay, watching the same amber light move across the cedar ridges. And she was not lonely, because the house was full of grandchildren and the sounds of a working ranch and the presence of people who loved her. She died in the spring of 1927, at 81, in the room she had shared with Elijah for 27 years, with Thomas holding one hand and James holding the other and Rosario sitting nearby. And she died as she had lived, clearly and without pretense, knowing exactly where she was and who she was and having no unresolved questions. The answer she had found when she came to settle the question her father had never answered had turned out to be Elijah Shepard, and the Cross S, and the limestone house, and the 3 children, and the grandchildren, and the cedar-scented October evenings, and the morning light over the Texas hills, and the full and complicated grace of a life built in the right place with the right person. It had been a very good answer. She had known it from the beginning. She had gone on knowing it every day of every year, which is the best that can be said of any answer, that it holds its truth all the way to the end. The Cross S stood. The land held the light the way it always had. And the story of the woman who came from Cincinnati with a question and found more than she had known to look for became part of what the Shepard family knew about itself, passed from grandmother to grandchild to great-grandchild. A story about the courage of a direct question and the extraordinary thing that can wait on the other side of the answer you were never given.